Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cutting right through the political noise and focusing strictly on the physical map of trade. We're going to use hard data, actual legal contracts, and look at what literally happened with the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This is a story about how global trade actually functions on the ground. Let's dive in. So how do you stop a $6.4 billion trade war? Because honestly, just recently, we were standing right on the precipice of a massive international standoff. Washington formally demanded financial compensation plus at least half ownership of this massive, brand new border bridge. They were basically threatening to block it from opening before a single commercial truck could even cross. It literally looked like the recipe for a trade war that would completely wreck North American supply chains. But incredibly, all that tension, all those looming threats of tariffs and blockades, they just evaporated in less than 72 hours. And there was no massive retaliation from Ottawa, no angry counter press conferences. Instead, the whole thing was resolved when Canada's Mark Carney simply picked up the phone and made a quiet, totally methodical call to Washington. Section 1, the $6 billion standoff, looking at the Gordie Howe International Bridge. To really grasp this political fight, you gotta understand the physical reality of the project itself. The Gordie Howe International Bridge is an absolutely monumental piece of infrastructure. It's a $6.4 billion project spanning the Detroit River, connecting straight into the major highway systems on both the US and Canadian sides. By doing that, it completely bypasses all that local city congestion. I mean, it was built specifically to handle heavy commercial freight and dramatically speed up the international supply chain. And you know that ultimately impacts how quickly and cheaply goods actually make it onto your local store shelves. Yet, right before this vital artery of trade could finally open for business, Washington tried to slam the brakes on the whole operation. They laid out three very specific, aggressive demands: block the opening, demand financial compensation, and demand at least half ownership of the asset. They approached this completely finalized, done deal project as if it were just an open negotiation. Moving to Section 2, the quiet phone call and the 2012 agreement. So, how exactly did Ottawa respond to these demands? Well, by pulling out the receipts. During his call, Mark Carney simply read from a legally binding contract that was signed way back in 2012. He read it like an auditor, going line by line over a balance sheet. And when you look at the terms of that deal, it's wild. Canada paid the entire upfront construction bill, including the highway links and the new customs plazas. Meanwhile, Michigan received joint ownership of the bridge, 50% of future toll revenues once costs are recovered, and they didn't have to put up a single dime of initial cash up front. So essentially, Washington was demanding half ownership of a bridge that their own state already owned half of. But he didn't just stop at the financials. Carney methodically laid out the physical, literal realities of the build. He pointed out that American steel, sourced directly from places like Pennsylvania and Indiana, was used for the construction. He noted that thousands of American workers were hired to actually build the thing, and crucially, he quietly explained that delaying the bridge wouldn't really punish Canada. No, it would immediately bottleneck American auto plants right there in Detroit and Toledo that absolutely rely on those exact parts. And just like that, the demands went quiet. The whole dispute de-escalated because, as the Canadian response so perfectly laid out, you simply cannot carry your way out of a ratified construction contract. A sudden political whim doesn't just overwrite a decade-old, mutually agreed-upon treaty. All right, Section 3, the math of logistics and the fall of the Ambassador Bridge. To really understand where Washington's interference came from, we have to ignore the politicians for a second and look squarely at the physical map of logistics. And the data here reveals a dramatic shift. For decades, the famous Ambassador Bridge in Detroit was the undisputed king of North American trade. But it recently lost its crown. Just look at the numbers for 2025. The smaller Blue Water Bridge, located about an hour north up in Sarnia, logged over 2.1 million commercial truck crossings. The Ambassador Bridge, it fell to 1.9 million. The map is literally changing right in front of us. And this wasn't just a temporary little blip either. Heading deep into early 2026, the data showed the gap between the two bridges is only getting wider. In just the first few months of the year, that northern crossing pulled in over 299,000 trucks, confirming that the Detroit corridor is now firmly stuck in second place. Now, the reason for this massive shift in international trade has absolutely nothing to do with loyalty or politics. It just comes down to basic math. At the Ambassador Bridge, a standard semi-truck costs roughly $135 just to cross the river. Go up north to the Blue Water Bridge, it's about $35. And the brand new Gordie Howe Bridge, well, it's set to heavily undercut the whole market at roughly $12 per axle. So the real kicker is this number right here, $100. A logistics fleet pushing hundreds of trucks across the border every single week can save roughly $100 per truck per trip, simply by driving an extra hour north to avoid the Detroit tolls. When you multiply that by thousands of trips a month, well, that kind of math isn't just a preference, right? It's literally a matter of business survival. As this quote perfectly sums it up, trucking companies operate entirely on profit margins. They aren't swayed by historical legacy or old habits. Their balance sheets completely dictate their routes. And lately, those balance sheets have been telling them loud and clear to avoid the Detroit corridor completely. They absolutely need efficiency and lower costs to stay in business.
Which brings us to Section 4, protecting a private monopoly. Here's the real motive behind the blockade.
Because when a massive shift in logistics happens, someone, somewhere, is losing a whole lot of money. We have to remember exactly what the old king of trade really is. The Ambassador Bridge is not a piece of public infrastructure. It's not a government asset at all. It is a privately owned toll crossing controlled by the Maroon family. For years, they enjoyed a virtual monopoly. But as that traffic data just showed us, they were rapidly losing their customer base to cheaper alternatives. So let's look at how intertwined business and politics can get when a private monopoly is suddenly threatened by a cheaper, faster, government-built alternative. First, the private bridge begins losing major traffic to those cheaper crossings. Second, according to reports, the owners actively lobby the administration and make donations to aligned political action committees. And third, right on cue, Washington steps up, demands money, and attempts to block the new Gordie Howe Bridge, citing trade fairness. Funny how that works, right? But here is a truly fascinating twist to that whole blockade attempt. Leaders inside Michigan had to immediately push back against their own federal government in Washington. They completely understood that delaying this new, hyper-efficient bridge would directly bottleneck their own auto manufacturing supply chains. So they actually had to fight to protect their local factories from the very federal maneuvers that were supposedly intended to regulate American trade. Finally, Section 5, the real map of trade. Let's see why math always wins. Let's pull all these puzzle pieces together into a crucial macro lesson about international economics. The reality on the ground is super simple, and it's perfectly reflected in these three takeaways. First, freight will always route through the path of least resistance. You can shout from a podium all you want, but the people actually moving the freight just want to get the job done quickly and cheaply. Second, cheaper tolls and faster roads dictate the map, not political loyalty. And third, deep economic integration, the kind that literally builds $6.4 billion bridges, relies entirely on binding treaties, not passing political moods. When the dust finally settles on a multi-billion-dollar standoff, loud threats usually have to contend with legally binding contracts and simple math. Volume doesn't win, documentation wins. The trucks will keep rolling, and the contracts will hold up. So the next time a flashy headline warns of an impending international trade war, ask yourself, what do the logistics balance sheets and the legal treaties actually say? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.